Hi folks, my name is Carl Will. I'm a volunteer tour guide here at the Missouri Memorial Association, which going forward in this presentation I'm going to call the Missouri. I'm an ex-naval officer. I was a submarine officer on board a Los Angeles class fast attack submarine based here in Pearl Harbor back in the 1980s. But much more importantly than that, I'm now allowed a couple of days a week to come by the Missouri and give tours, typically to visitors like you. We love to spend a couple days just talking about the history of the ship, its operational characteristics, etc. Right now, because of the coronavirus pandemic that's affecting the entire world, and certainly affecting us here in Hawaii, visitor count has dropped off to next to nothing, and the museum itself is actually closed. We're not performing any visitor operations whatsoever at this point in time until things get a little safer. But because of that, and because of the fact that we're approaching a very important date in the Missouri's history, April the 11th, we thought it'd be useful perhaps to put a part of our standard, what we called highlight tour, on videotape and allow you to hear the story of the Kamikaze attack that occurred on the Missouri and how it impacted literally the ship on April the 11th, 1945. Since you can't be here, let me give you just a highlight of what we normally do when you do show up. 35-minute tour typically, spend a little time at the forward part of the ship or the bow talking about the operational history of the vessel and its physical characteristics, a little bit about the gun system. We go back to the surrender deck and spend some time talking about the events of the surrender ceremony that occurred on September the 2nd, 1945 that ended World War II. And then we make our way all the way back aft to the starboard side of the ship, what we call the Kamikaze deck. It's just forward of the fantail. And we talk a bit about the history of the Kamikaze strike. You can't be here today. This version is going to be just a little bit longer than the version that you would get if you were actually walking the decks of the ship, and I'm going to have a couple of photos that I'm going to address and talk about. But hopefully you've got the time to sit back and listen. It shouldn't take very long at all, and after all, you're confined at home. What else do you have to do besides listen to me? So anyway, here we go. All right, so kamikazes. Yeah, we all come to that term with a set of preconceived notions. I certainly did before I came to the Missouri. People sometimes think kamikaze means suicide plane or it means torpedo bomber. While I'm sure I'm doing a terrible job pronouncing the Japanese term kamikaze, it actually translates almost literally as divine wind. And the origin of the story, the origin of the reason why it translates as divine wind goes all the way back to the 13th century. Genghis Khan. We all know who Genghis Khan is. Genghis Khan was the first Mongol leader, the first great Khan. He was like Kamehameha the first here in Hawaii in the 1700s. Genghis Khan was the first Mongol leader that united all the nomadic tribes into one effective fighting force. And effectively, as far as he was concerned, conquered almost the entire world. In fact, it was the largest contiguous geographical empire to this day that has ever been assembled. When he died, as is usual, there was a series of succession wars and controversies amongst his clan. But eventually it wound up shaking out with the Mongol Empire breaking up into several pieces, run typically by his grandchildren. The part that was northern China, Mongolia, and Korea was run by his grandson, a kid by the name of Kublai Khan. And if you're a history fan at all, and familiar with the Marco Polo Chronicles, Kublai Khan is the guy that Marco Polo spent 17 years with in his travels in that time frame, wandering around the Far East, and eventually making his way back to Europe and becoming famous. Kublai Khan, like all leaders, all Mongol leaders, wanted to expand the empire. If you look at a map and the areas I just laid out, if he were to go northwest or southwest, he'd wind up running into his siblings and starting civil wars. Or at least his relatives. The only place he could go was to southern China and enter a war with the Song dynasty in southern China, which he did throughout the course of the 1270s. Because the Japanese supported the Song dynasty in those wars, and because they were effectively a group of pirate-supported raiders harassing the Mongol fleets, Kublai Khan decided to punish them and expand the empire by attempting invasions. And he did that twice, 1274 and 1281. Great stories in their own right, fabulous history. samurai, Mongol horse archers galloping across the plains, shoguns. You have the dynamics of the samurai warriors with single sword combat against a single opponent, playing off against the thousands of nomadic horse archers galloping, shooting arrows on the fly. I won't spoil the story for you. It's interesting in its own right, but we only have a little bit of time here today. Go to the Wikipedia page tonight if you've got nothing else to do and read about the Mongol invasions of Japan. Fascinating stuff. But the thing that matters for us here on the Missouri today is that in both invasion attempts, typhoons developed that had the effect of damaging the supply fleets, the rather primitive troop transport vessels, and effectively forcing the evacuation of the Mongol horse armies. And if it had happened once, the Japanese probably would have written it off to luck of the draw like we would today. But it didn't happen once, it happened twice. Separated by 7 years, these storms developed just at the right time to have the maximum effect on the Mongol fleet and save them from imminent invasion from superior armies. To the 13th century mind, there's probably only one explanation for that, and it was divine intervention. Their deities had interceded on their behalfs to save them from the Mongol invasions. And because of that, they've always called those winds divine winds, or kamikaze. And that's why the term kamikaze exists today. It would have been a cute story. It would have been a historical anecdote if it had stayed right there. But what you've got to do now is fast forward almost 700 years to the middle of the 1944 time frame. Now the Japanese nation, and interestingly in that interim time frame, the Japanese as a nation were never threatened seriously with a foreign invasion. So effectively the kamikazes worked. But now it's late 1944, mid-1944, they're surrounded by the Allied submarine fleet, choking off commerce. They're losing major battles on the mainland. They're losing islands to the island hopping campaign of the Allies moving through the Pacific island chains. The strategic bombing initiative is just about to get in range. And remember, this is 1944. They're watching what's happening in Germany. Excuse me. They know what's about to unfold on them, and they are desperate. They're trying lots of special programs, lots of different things. None of them are working. Somebody came up with the idea of let's try to resurrect the concept of the kamikaze. It saved us last time. Maybe it'll work again this time. Except this time they're not going to wait for a storm. They're going to create their own kamikaze. They're going to create their own divine wind, and they're going to make it out of aircraft, propellers, human pilots, aviation fuel, and 500-pound armor-piercing bombs. And so they started training their teenage pilots, the rudimentary aspects of flight. How do you take off in an aircraft? How do you maneuver it in the air a little bit? A whole lot less probably on how you safely land one of these things. You give them basic flight training, you take an airplane, you fill it with as much aviation fuel as you can possibly stuff in an aircraft, put that 500-pound bomb strapped to the bottom of it, get these young pilots somewhere near an Allied fleet, and have them crash it into the nearest ship that they can find. As we all saw in 9/11, tragically, if you can get an aircraft filled with aviation fuel inside of an enclosed structure and ignite it, blow it up, the effect is just devastating. Kamikazes didn't typically damage ships, they sank them. Admiral Halsey once said that the only weapon he feared during the course of World War II was the kamikaze. Effectively, there is no real defense against it if it's being flown by a pilot who is willing to give up his life. So the Japanese began using this tactic. They introduced it for the first time effectively in late 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But it really came to fruition in Okinawa, April 1945. Hundreds and hundreds of kamikazes were used in mass attacks on the Allied fleet that were offshore, transporting troops, supplies, and supporting the land invasion on Okinawa. Books have been written about the subject, and for those of you who are truly interested, I encourage you to go and find. There's been a couple of new ones written very recently. But in summary, and the reason why the Japanese used the tactic repeatedly is because it worked. It worked very, very well. The U.S. suffered its largest single ship loss in terms of ships sunk in a single campaign that it had ever suffered to that point in time, or for that matter, has suffered to this point in time, to date. An absolutely devastating tactic. 34 ships in the U.S. fleet were sunk off of Okinawa to kamikaze attacks. And in all honesty, there were no battleships sunk. There were aircraft carriers that were frightfully damaged. The armored larger vessels were somewhat protected against these types of attacks, but troop transports, supply ships, landing vehicles were enormously effective and suffered greatly throughout the course of the attacks. We think the Japanese lost somewhere around 4,000 of their own young men flying these types of missions. A truly horrific weapon system for everybody involved. The government that ordered its use, certainly the pilots that had to fly these missions, most dramatically for the crews of the targets who had to sit there trying to shoot these aircraft down as they were flying in with bombs strapped to the bottom of them and a pilot who just didn't care. Horrific weapon system. On April the 11th, 1945, while the Missouri was underway off of Okinawa, 2:43 in the afternoon, the lookout sighted a low-flying Zeke aircraft about 100 feet off the waterline, off the starboard quarter, the right-hand rear side of the ship. They opened up, with anti-aircraft fire, all the weapons in that side of the ship. They hit the aircraft a couple of times, but the, I guess not surprising thing about kamikazes is you can't just damage them. You have to splash them, as they called it. You had to knock them in the water. Minor damage doesn't matter for an aircraft that's not trying to get home. You could even have the pilot dead, shot, and have the plane fly on a relatively stable course for a short period of time. So they really tried their best to knock the things down into the water and stop them. In the Missouri's case, they were unable to do that. The aircraft approached, and what I'm about to show you is a photo, one of the most famous photos ever taken during the war. This famous photograph, it's in almost every book on the Pacific War, shows the Zeke aircraft just before the moment of impact, and was taken by a crew member on the starboard side of the Missouri from the O2 level, 2 decks above the wooden deck that you can see that's most prominent in the picture. What I want you to note here are 2 separate things, both of which probably helped to avoid serious casualties on board the Missouri that day. First, look at the kamikaze's left wingtip. It's below the level of the main deck plates. Has an impact, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The second thing I want you to notice is that the plane in that aspect is moving almost parallel to the Missouri's own direction of motion. It's flying in the same direction almost that the Missouri is traveling in. When the wingtip of the kamikaze finally collided with the outer hull plates of the Missouri, and note, just for technical reasons, those outer hull plates are not the battleship armor. The battleship armor is actually quite a bit inboard from there. Those outer hull plates, those steel plates, are just relatively thin structural steel. But it caused the aircraft, because it hit by the wingtip, caused the aircraft to cartwheel into the ship's side and to start to break up. Most of the plane, and fortunately the bomb, fell into the water. The bomb did not explode. Truthfully, we don't really know why. Armor-piercing bombs and projectiles of that era were typically designed with delayed action fuses. They prevented detonation upon contact, but initiated detonation a few hundredths of a second later. Theoretically, after an armor plate had been penetrated and the bomb was on the inside of the armor protection. Those fuses had sensors that were built in that sensed sudden deceleration of the type that would be incurred when you're trying to pass through an armored plate, and that would start the delayed action fuse timer. Some people have speculated that the delayed fuse on this bomb was never armed because of the glancing blow, the fact that the aircraft was moving in the same direction as the Missouri and the relative velocities were lower. Or maybe it was just a dud. We'll never know for sure, but we can be pretty sure that the crew was happy that the darn thing didn't explode. Look in the picture, look at all the guys that are standing around there, all of them effectively standing in the open with minor pieces of armor between them and the exploding aircraft, or what was about to be the exploding aircraft. Following impact, the plane's starboard wing detached, flew up onto the deck of the Missouri, leaking and spraying aviation fuel everywhere, all of which subsequently and probably obviously ignited. This photo shows the Missouri on fire following the attack, taken from a nearby ship. Some observers thought that the Missouri might actually be sinking. As it turns out, the crew was able to get the fire under control in less than 3 minutes. Most of the damage was caused by surface aviation fuel, burned off, no serious casualties on board. Somewhat miraculous given the effectiveness of the Kamikazes overall. Battleships, it turns out, didn't make great targets for the Kamikazes. As I referenced earlier, supply ships, troop transports, and unarmored vessels of all types were usually much more susceptible. Cleaning up afterwards, the crew, interestingly, came upon the remains of the Kamikaze pilot. He was dead, of course, but he'd been thrown clear of the aircraft upon impact and thrown up onto the ship's deck. You can probably imagine they didn't have a lot of love for this guy. Moments before, he had been trying to kill everybody on board and probably considered throwing the body overboard. But the ship's captain, Captain Callahan, interceded, directed that the remains be taken down to the below decks to the ship's dispensary for ID and for preparation for burial. It was his intention to give this Kamikaze pilot a full at-sea burial with full military honors. To be buried in a military ceremony, you need to be buried in a flag of the country of your origin. As you might have guessed, the Missouri didn't carry very many Rising Sun flags in April of 1945, and so a group of the crew assembled or made a makeshift Rising Sun flag. We don't know what they made it out of, probably bed sheets or things of that nature, but nonetheless they eventually got one stitched together in time for the ceremony conducted on April the 12th. The ceremony was filmed. It was conducted with respect by the ship's chaplain, and the body was committed to the deep. If you come and visit the Missouri, we'll show you exactly where that occurred, where the footsteps of the honor guard were, and where the body was sent overboard. The crew didn't know, obviously, at the time of the ceremony who the pilot was. How could they? They simply had a damaged body they were burying into the ocean. But we now know that the pilot was almost certainly Petty Officer Second Class Ishino, 19-year-old kid, likely flying his first combat mission for his country. Petty Officer Ishino's family has visited the Missouri since its opening as a museum ship back in 1999, and they've given us two photos of him. The first photo you see here is of him in his flight gear, and to me looks like most other World War II photos of combat military individuals. He's in uniform, he's young, he's fit, he's ready to head out to the war and do his duty. And other than the obvious racial characteristics of his image, he could easily be an Italian tank driver, a German artilleryman, an American Marine, or a Russian infantryman. They all look the same in many ways, very formalized photos as far as I'm concerned. The second photo, though, has always been the one that's very poignant for me personally. While we don't know the exact date the picture was taken, Ishino, and he's the little kid in the image that you can see near, the one that's sitting on the woman's lap. It looks to me to be about 2 years old, plus or minus. He's sitting in a family portrait on a family member's lap. Look at what he's holding in his hand. He's holding a model airplane. And I apologize for the size of this photo. On the ship, it's much larger and easier to see. This is the best copy I could find today. But if he is two, the picture was taken somewhere around 1927, at a time when almost all little kids in the world were all making model airplanes and dreaming of learning how to fly in the new technological wonder of the age, the aircraft. Petty Officer Ishino got his swish. He learned to fly. He flew at least once that we know of, and he died doing it on April the 11th, 1945, 2:43 in the afternoon, right on the deck of the USS Missouri. Even today, with visitors from across the world here at the Missouri, the war in the Pacific during World War II generates intense controversy. Geopolitical rationales, who started it, how was it fought, the brutality that was involved, sneak attacks, war crimes committed, the atomic bombings. The list of controversial topics is endless. But Petty Officer Ishino's childhood photo has always highlighted something for me personally. At the grand strategic level, we're told, especially active duty military, we're told that some wars just have to be fought. And honestly, if any war ever had to be fought, it was probably World War II. But down at the level of an individual, from any side, and I love using the Japanese military member as an example for this point, war and the death that results from war is always a tragedy. Ishino was a kid once who wanted to fly. He didn't invent the kamikaze. He didn't start the war. He probably didn't want to be sitting in that airplane on April the 11th, but he did do his duty for his country like millions of other soldiers from all the participant nations. He died, and what he accomplished that day was to put a dent in the side rail of the Missouri, a dent that we never bothered to fix. It was insignificant and not worth the trouble. Come and visit us, and I'll show it to you in person. It's simply a bend, a slight bend in one of the guardrails on the outboard side of the main deck. Petty Officer Ishino never grew up. He never got married. He never had kids of his own. Those kids never produced grandkids, and those grandkids who were never born aren't going to produce any great-grandkids. Petty Officer Ishino's death probably means that there are 10 or 15 human beings that aren't here today. It's tragic. But when you take that number and you multiply it by the estimated 69 million people who were killed in all theaters of World War II, 50 million of which, by the way, were considered non-combatants, women, children, neutral country residents who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when the bomb fell through the roof, you can really get a sense of the calamity that World War II actually was and how much beyond dollars and cents that the war cost us all. This whole story isn't particularly well known outside of the Missouri circles. April the 11th, the attack occurred. April 12th, the ceremony occurred in the Far East. Later that same day, back on the East Coast in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away. And what normally would have been an international news event potentially with the captain of a wartime combatant during a campaign treating an enemy war dead with magnanimous respect, instead wasn't covered at all for good reasons. There were more important things that had occurred in the world that day. With FDR's passing, Harry S. Truman, the vice president, became the president of the United States, and kind of brings us full circle in many ways. Because if FDR had been president, it's unlikely he would have picked the Missouri as the surrender ship. Instead, Truman had the choice to make that choice. Truman chose the ship that his daughter had christened back in January of 1944, and the Missouri's place in history was solidified. Anyway, so that's the story. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. There's so much more on board the Missouri itself, and I know this isn't a replacement for your on-site visits. Really hope you have a chance when conditions warrant to get you back out here and do this in person, hear the entire highlight tour. There's so much more history, so much more technology. You know, I often tell visitors at the end of my tour that the United States is a relatively young country by world standards. We don't have much physical history. You know, much of the early history of our country was built in wooden buildings that have been long since replaced, cities and towns that perhaps aren't there anymore. We don't have a Great Pyramid, at least not like the one in Egypt. We don't have a Colosseum. We don't have Notre Dame. But what we do have is the Mighty Mo, one small piece of physical history that represents an important turning point during the World War II. And it's a placeholder, I think, for all generations, old and young. I have a particular interest in the technological aspect of the ship. It's a technological marvel at the time it was built, and in many ways remains one to this day. So I invite you, and the entire Missouri staff invite you to swing by, pay a visit next time you're out here and enjoying the beach. And until then, I wish you the best. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you when you come. Aloha.